today's movie review, I'll be reviewing The Meg. The movie's based on a 1997 book, Meg, a novel of deep-sea terror by Steve Alten. Now, normally this would be the point in time in which I would typically say, even though the movie's based on a book, I've never read the book. Well, that changes today because I've actually read the book in which this movie is based on, and it's one of my favorite books of all time. And this movie was a long time coming, for one of two reasons. The first reason being that when I first heard the movie was getting a book adaptation, this was back in 2006. Yeah, a little over a decade ago, so in a sense, I looked forward to this movie for a long time, which leads me into my second point about the movie. Even though I said that I've been waiting for this movie for a little over a decade, well, The Meg itself has been in development hell for 2 decades, and it's been all over the place, from one studio to another, with Disney, or at least one of their subdivisions, being the first studio to acquire the rights of the novel during the late 90s, only for the rights to revert back to the author. Fast forward to the year 2005, New Line Cinema acquires the rights for the novel. It even had names attached to production from the likes of the person that directed movies such as Speed and Twister, with Guillermo del Toro being the producer. However, New Line Cinemas canceled the project due to budgetary concerns, thus the rights were reverted back to the author once again. Fast forward a decade later in the year 2015, when Warner Brothers finally acquires the rights to the movie and begins production on it. And it was reported that Eli Roth, the same director as movies such as Cabin Fever, Hostels Part 1 and 2, along with The Green Inferno, was originally supposed to direct the movie but left due to creative differences, although John Turtletub, or however you pronounce his name, the same guy that directed the 2 National Treasure movies along with the 2010 live-action attempt of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, would ultimately end up directing The Meg. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm kind of surprised the director didn't cast Nicolas Cage as the lead in this movie. But anywho, despite The Meg having a very lengthy production history, its timing in terms of when it's released could not have been any more perfect. Because not only are we living in a time where we're getting new monster movies from the likes of Pacific Rim, Godzilla, or Rampage, we're also getting theatrical shark movies again from the likes of The Shallows and 47 Meters Down. Which leads me into my big question for the movie. Was it worth the wait to see The Meg finally hit the big screen after all these years? As for the plot of the movie, it's about this rescue diver named Jonas Taylor, who was forced into retirement when attempting a rescue mission in which he claimed to have seen a massive unidentified sea creature. 5 years after the incident, Jonas Taylor soon gets called back into action when a research vessel loses contact with an underwater research facility. While searching for this research vessel, the same massive identified sea creature from 5 years earlier soon shows up again, revealing itself to be a living, breathing megalodon that soon makes its way towards the surface and begins its feeding frenzy. And now it's up to Jonas Taylor along with the crew of the underwater research facility to stop the megalodon before it devours any more beachgoers. In terms of what I liked about the movie, the kid character in this movie was a lot better than I thought she was going to be, because anytime you watch an action movie and they include a kid character, they are guaranteed to be the worst aspect of the movie, especially in a monster movie, because they usually come off as annoying as all hell to a point where you want to see the kid get their comeuppance or get eaten by the monster. And it doesn't even help the fact that the little girl in this movie never appears in the book. That being said, she's probably one of the better kid characters I've seen in a movie like this, where she's not annoyed, she's cute in an endearing sense, and she actually had some funny lines of dialogue and played well off some of the other actors, especially Jason Statham's character of Jonas Taylor. What do I mean by this? Do you remember back in Iron Man 3 how a lot of people praised the interaction between Tony Stark and the little kid character? It's basically that all over again, but I think it's handled better here, because with something like Iron Man 3 where you had Tony Stark playing off the kid, I think Tony Stark played well off the kid, but I thought the kid was really annoying. Whereas the relationship between Jonas Taylor and the kid character in this movie they play off each other pretty well. Another facet of the movie that I liked is the fact that the filmmakers knew what they were making. Because with the recent wave of sharksploitation movies, no pun intended, most of those movies either try really hard to be the next Jaws, or they become campy on purpose in order to gain a cult following. But when it came to the filmmakers of this movie, they knew that they were just making a generic killer shark movie, where it's not trying to be the next Jaws, but it's not trying to be bad on purpose. And I'll talk about the movie's tone later, but at least the filmmakers behind the Meg knew the type of movie they were making. And on top of that, if you really look at the advertising for the Meg, you basically see Jason Statham along with several other actors battling the Megalodon. And the movie does exactly that. It delivers the goods, because we do indeed see Jason Statham along with several other actors like Ruby Rose and that one guy from The Office battling a Megalodon. So in a sense, no false advertising. As far as the acting goes, I think it's pretty good for what is required of the movie, because the characters in the movie are not the most fleshed out characters in really any movie. They're basically nothing but archetypes, but I think that the actors play these archetypes very well. Granted, I do have a problem in terms of how the characters are depicted in the movie in comparison to the source material, but I'll talk about that later. As far as the CGI goes, it's passable, depending on when it's used, because the CGI on the Megalodon itself looks fantastic. As far as some of the other sea creatures go, it's a mixed bag, depending on what it's used on, because there's a point in time where you see a couple whales swimming by. The whales look great, but as for some of the other sea creatures that live within the Mariana Trench that isn't the Megalodon, it's a mixed bag, because for some of the smaller creatures, the CGI looks alright. Sure, it could have been polished a lot more, but it does its job. But for some of the larger sea creatures that live within the Mariana Trench, like the giant squid, the CGI on that giant squid doesn't look very good. If anything, it looks very cartoonish, and it's probably the weakest CGI sea creature in the entire movie. But it only shows up for like 20 seconds, so it's not too bad. And in regards to the movie's overall pacing, I have mixed feelings towards it, because on one hand, I do believe that the movie is well paced from start to finish in terms of how the movie goes from one scene to another, allowing the movie to take its time establishing the characters, the setting, the situations. But here's the thing, if this was any other movie, having the movie take its time with its pacing to establish said characters, setting, and situations would be perfect. However, for a movie like The Meg, on the other hand, I feel like that should not really be the case, because let's look at the movie. It's about a group of people battling a giant prehistoric shark. The pacing should have been a lot more brisk in terms of establishing characters, setting, and situations, which leads me to another aspect of the movie that I have conflicting feelings about: the movie's overall tone. And as far as the tone of the movie goes, the first half of the movie takes itself way too seriously to be any fun, yet by the time you get to the second half of the movie, it becomes goofy as all hell, which makes it fun to watch. Actually, the more I think about it, the movie's clash of tones is really what affects the movie's overall pacing. Because as I said earlier in regards to the movie's overall pacing, it does indeed take its time establishing the characters, the setting, and the scenario of man versus prehistoric shark. Yet when you mix that with the serious tone of the first half of the movie, it creates this weird illusion that the movie's moving a lot slower than it really is. And as the movie continues, the pacing remains the same, but the second half of the movie in regards to its tone goes from being serious to giving off campy vibes. And mixing those campy vibes with the movie's consistent pacing, the movie itself actually flows a lot better from one action set piece to another. And I feel that if the movie had these campy vibes from the very start of the movie, I think the movie in terms of both its tone and pacing would have been a lot better. But as it is, it's kind of all over the place. So in terms of what I disliked about the movie, remember how I said at the very start of this review about how the book in which this movie is based on is one of my favorite books, and I waited a long time to see this movie become a reality? Well, it's sad to say that The Meg is not a very good book-to-movie adaptation. And I get that when you're adapting a book into a movie, you want to at least keep the general concepts and spirit of the book and have them in the movie. But the way the movie goes about adapting the book is completely different, to a point where the movie is just a loose adaptation of the book. To illustrate how different the movie is from its source material, I'm going to list some examples. The story in the book is a shark horror story with some psychological moments. The movie, on the other hand, is a action-adventure blockbuster. As far as character depictions go, I don't think I'll talk about every single character, but I'll try to cover as much as I can, starting with the main character, Jonas Taylor. because in the book he starts his career off as a marine biologist who's working with the US Navy on a top secret experiment. Something goes wrong, which leads into a tragic event that not only kills his career as a marine biologist, but the US Navy label him as a scapegoat for said event, which leads him down the path of paleontology in order to study more about the megalodon and prove its existence. And when given the opportunity to go back to the Mariana Trench, he takes the opportunity to prove, once and for all, whether or not the megalodon does or does not exist, while not only experiencing the occasional PTSD, but also experiencing the occasional blackout. As for the movie depiction of Jonas Taylor, he starts his career off as a rescue diver who's attempting to rescue the crew of a sinking nuclear submarine, and does manage to rescue all but 2 people, which leads to his retirement, becoming an alcoholic boat mechanic in Thailand who gets called back into becoming a rescue diver once more. And to add on top of that, you have Jason Statham doing his usual shtick while hunting a megalodon. Now, do you see how different Jonas Taylor is depicted in both the book and the movie? Well, imagine the rest of the cast of characters, because they get the same kind of treatment like Jonas. Starting with Mac, because the one thing that both the book and the movie have in common with this character's depiction is the fact that he is the best friend of Jonas Taylor. And this is the point where I point out how different Mac is from book to movie, because in the book, he is a short-tempered, wisecracking alcoholic who often gets both himself and his friends in trouble, and his profession is being a helicopter pilot. The movie version of the character is one of the many lead researchers at the underwater facility, and when a situation does go horribly wrong, he remains level-headed throughout the situation, trying to figure out how to fix the problem. Then you have the wife of Jonas Taylor, because in the book, her name is Maggie, she is a ruthless reporter, and she has a estranged relationship with Jonas to a point that she is often cheating on him with her own cameraman, and throughout the book, she is a reoccurring character. In terms of how this character is depicted in the movie, her name is Lori, and her job profession is that she is one of the many scientists that works at the underwater facility, and when she, along with her 2 co-workers, encounter the megalodon at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, she does show genuine care for her co-workers, and much like the movie depiction of Mac, she too is level-headed. And sometime later in the movie, when she meets up with Jonas again, despite the 2 of them being divorced, the 2 of them come to a mutual understanding to a point that they can get along as friends. And the last detail you need to know about the character is the fact that she herself is a minor character within the context of the movie. Then comes the lead female character herself, and this is what the book and movie version have in common. Her job profession is that she is a marine biologist who has a chip on her shoulder, she cares deeply for her father, and when she meets Jonas at first, she doesn't really like him, but as the story progresses, she starts to slowly fall in love with him. And then here's where they differ. In the book, her name's Terry, she's Japanese and single, and she's got no kid. As for her movie counterpart, her name is Suyin John. She's Chinese, and at one point in her life, she was married and is a single mother. Then you have the megalodon itself, in terms of how it's depicted, because the one thing that both the book and the movie depictions have in common is the fact that it's a megalodon that swims, eats, and swims some more. So yeah, there's really not much to the megalodon in terms of character because it is a giant animal. So how does the movie depiction of the megalodon differ from its source material? Well, in the book, the megalodon is described as having these dark blue eyes, and because it lived at the bottom of the Mariana Trench for so long, it developed the ability to become bioluminescent, allowing it to glow this ghostly white color. In terms of how the megalodon is depicted in the movie, it has these black eyes and this yellowish-brown skin texture. So yeah, there's really not much to the movie depiction of the megalodon in general. Now, I could continue on and talk about how a lot of the support cast from the movie differ from their book counterparts, but I think I've made my point. Now, as far as the action is concerned, as it sits, the Meg has a lot of action sequences that I recognize from the book, but in terms of how and why it occurs is completely different. For example, there is a scene that the 2 of them have in common where at one point a character gets into a giant plexiglass cylinder shark cage, But in the book, they do it to observe the Megalodon, while in the movie, they do it in an attempt to kill the Megalodon. And honestly, I can make the rest of this review me explain how different the Meg is from its source material, but however, I don't want to do that only because I want somebody to go read the book if you have the opportunity. And second, I think I've given plenty of examples as to why the Meg is different from its source material. So moving on in terms of what I disliked about the movie in terms of it being a movie, the soundtrack that was composed for this movie is so generic and bland that it becomes forgettable. Because when I did watch the movie, I definitely remember there being some music cues here and there, but after I left the theater, I had a hard time trying to remember any beat or rhythm from the movie itself. Like when I got home from seeing the movie and started working on this review, I actually had to pull up the soundtrack just to listen to it to see if I remembered it or not. And upon listening to the music that was composed for the movie, it doesn't sound that bad, but the problem is, it sounds way too familiar. For example, there are certain musical cues that sound so whimsical that you probably would have thought that it came from a Steven Spielberg movie, or there are some musical cues that sound so foreboding that you probably thought it came from a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And therein lies the problem with the soundtrack. The music composed for the Meg sounds so much like music you hear from other movies that it doesn't give the Meg a identifiable soundtrack. Actually, correction, I do remember one piece of music from this movie, but the thing is, it wasn't music that was composed for the movie. The song itself is pre-existing, but in a weird way, because the movie plays Hey Mickey, but it's like a Chinese or a Thai cover of the song, which is really weird for sure, but it made me think, if the movie had a really unusual soundtrack like that, I think it would be a bit more memorable. I also hate how this movie really panders to the Chinese demographic because in the past decade, Hollywood realizes that they can't rely on just domestic box office numbers. They also have to rely on international box office numbers, more specifically from that of China. In an effort to appeal to the Chinese market, the filmmakers made some drastic changes from the source material in order to appeal to the Chinese demographic. For example, remember how I said earlier that the main female character in the book is a Japanese woman, yet in the movie she's now Chinese? And it doesn't stop there, because her father, along with some of the other co-workers who are Japanese in the book, are now Chinese in the movie. The locations that the Megalodon attacks are completely different as well, because in the book, the Megalodon attacks the California coastline, more specifically, the San Diego Bay. In the movie, the Megalodon attacks the Chinese coastline, more specifically, the Sanya Bay area. Granted, I got nothing against the Chinese, but as far as the American filmmaking goes, it concerns me moving forward because this tells me that Hollywood cares more about whether or not the movie can make a profit as opposed to making a good product. And in this instance, instead of trying to make a movie that everyone can enjoy, it feels like they are just pandering to a specific group of people. Also, this movie has a massive plot hole revolved around the Megalodon itself. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, within the first 5 minutes in the movie, we open up with an action sequence with Jonas Taylor attempting to rescue a crew of a sinking nuclear submarine off the coast of the Philippines, in which he encounters the Megalodon for the first time. Fast forward to 5 years later, when the actual plot of the movie begins, one of the scientists believes that what most people think is the bottom of the Mariana Trench is really a cloud of hydrogen sulfide covering the true bottom of the Mariana Trench, forming a thermocline in which you have the cold water above the sulfide, while below the sulfide you have the warm water. This eventually leads into the plot of the movie, in which Jonas Taylor has to go through the sulfide to reach the bottom, rescue the scientists stranded in the Mariana Trench, then go through the sulfide again, but in doing so, this allows the warm water to seep through the sulfide into the cold water, allowing the Megalodon to swim into the current ocean. Now, do you notice the plot hole surrounding the Megalodon? Because there's one key detail that I forgot to mention a few moments ago, and it's the fact that the Megalodon could only survive in warm water environments. This is even established as such in the movie. And since the water below the layer of sulfide is nothing but warm water, the Megalodon could only exist in that environment. Yet, why does the movie begin with the Megalodon attacking a nuclear submarine, not in the Mariana Trench, but in the Philippines? Like, in order for that Megalodon to have attack that nuclear submarine in the Philippines, it had to have swam through that layer of hydrogen sulfide, entered the cold ocean above it, and then proceed to the Philippines afterwards, even though the characters established that the Megalodon could only survive in a warm water environment, and the only reason why the Megalodon was able to enter the current ocean landscape later in the movie was because Jonas allowed warm water to seep through the hydrogen sulfide entering the cold ocean. Like, it'd be one thing if the movie began in the Mariana Trench, then I think it would have made a lot more sense. But since it began in the Philippines, it's just raising questions that aren't gonna get answered. I also wasn't really the biggest fan in terms of how they killed off the Megalodon in the movie, because not only is it different from the book, I just found the way they killed it in the movie to be very underwhelming, because in the book, I'm not going to reveal exactly how they killed the Megalodon, but it was very intense. It made for a unique climax. With the movie, on the other hand, it starts out promising, but when the characters do end up killing the Megalodon, it was very underwhelming. And I do think that the movie could have benefited by having more gore, because the book, as I said earlier, is a B horror movie, whereas the actual movie itself is an action adventure. And sure, there are points in time where you do see people and sea creatures bleed, but I think the movie could have pushed it a bit further, again, that R rating, and be more like a horror movie. So, for my final verdict of The Meg, I have mixed feelings towards the movie, because if you remember what I said at the start of the review, I stated that the book in which this movie is based on is one of my favorite books of all time, and I waited years for this movie to become a reality. And judging this movie as a book-to-movie adaptation, it's disappointing, because the book in which this movie is based on pen and paper, should have been an easy book-to-movie adaptation to make. But I feel that because the movie has been in development hell for so long, and that by the time Warner Bros. Finally got their hands on the movie, it feels like they took a lot of creative missteps when adapting Meg into a full-length feature movie. But at the same time, if I had to judge the movie based on its own terms of just being a movie, I still liked it very much as a big, dumb, fun creature feature. In that sense of featuring a cast of characters composed of scientists hunting down a prehistoric sea monster, terrorizing beachgoers type scenario. And as far as a killer shark movie goes, it's nowhere near as good as Jaws, but I do think that The Meg is better than your average movie set within the sharksploitation genre. So, overall, The Meg is a disappointing book-to-movie adaptation, but makes for a passable creature feature, as long as you know what you're getting yourself into. And before my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about The Meg? So it looks like the movie got generally mixed to average reception. And so for my final rating of The Meg, I give it a 3 out of 5. So, what is a book-to-movie adaptation that you find to be disappointing, but you still like the movie anyways? And see you later.